He ate like a man who had stopped believing food was real, both hands shaking, head down, silent. Eleanor Hayes watched from across the table and felt something she hadn't felt in 2 years of widowhood, not pity. Something colder. Something that looked like recognition. If you're moved by this story of survival and second chances, subscribe to this channel and follow along until the very end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The summer of 1883 came in hard and mean across the Colorado Rockies, and it didn't apologize to anybody. Eleanor Hayes had been awake since before dawn, same as every morning since Samuel died, because sleep past 4 a.m. felt like surrender, and surrender was a thing she couldn't afford. Not with 32 head of cattle to move before the creek flooded again. Not with a barn roof that leaked in 2 places, and a well rope that had frayed down to the last few strands of useful fiber. Not with a property line dispute that Judge Harlan Moss kept delaying for reasons she understood perfectly well and couldn't prove to anyone. She was hauling water from the creek when she heard the barn door. Not the wind. The wind she knew. The wind had a particular rhythm on her property. It came from the northwest, curled around the big ponderosa at the ridge line, and hit the barn at an angle that made the north-facing door rattle twice before settling. This sound was different, deliberate, slow. Eleanor set the bucket down without spilling a drop. She walked to the barn, the way she walked everywhere, without hurry, without theater. She picked up the pitchfork from where it leaned against the fence post, not because she planned to use it, but because a woman alone on 40 acres of Colorado mountain land did not go toward unfamiliar sounds without something in her hands. She pushed the barn door open. The man was on his knees in the straw beside her bay mare, and he had both hands raised, not in surrender, but in a kind of exhausted offering, like a man who had been surrendering to things for so long, the gesture had become automatic. "Ma'am," he said. His voice came out cracked and dry as August riverbed. "I ain't here to steal. I just need—" He stopped, swallowed like it cost him something. "I need to not die in this barn." Eleanor looked at him. His boots were split open at the toe on the left foot, the leather curled back like a wound. His shirt had been torn and retied so many times that it was essentially a collection of knots holding each other together. His face was burned red from sun exposure and cracked at the lips, and there was a particular quality to his eyes, not dangerous, not crazy. Just the flat, dull look of a man who had been operating past the edge of his body's tolerance for so long that he had stopped registering pain as an event and started registering it as a climate. He was also, she noticed, gripping his left side with one hand. Not dramatically, not pressing hard, just resting his hand against his ribs the way you'd hold a loose fence rail steadily, quietly, like if you let go, it might fall apart. "How long?" she said. He blinked. "Ma'am?" "How long since you ate?" It wasn't a question. She could see the answer in the way his collarbones pressed against his shirt, in the slight tremor in his raised hands, in the fact that he was still on his knees, not because he was being respectful, but because getting up required calories he no longer possessed. "4 days, he said. "Maybe 5. I lost a day somewhere up near Spruce Ridge." Eleanor studied him for another long moment. She was not a soft woman. She had not been soft even before Samuel died. Soft didn't last long on the frontier, and she'd known that coming out from Ohio 12 years ago with nothing but a trunk and a new husband and a stubbornness that her mother had called a character flaw, and that Eleanor had decided to reclassify as an adaptive trait. But 2 years of running the Hayes homestead alone had done something additional to her, had stripped away whatever remained of the polite instinct to comfort strangers, to soften edges, to offer reassurance before it was earned. She looked at this man, and she made a calculation. That was what she did now. She calculated. He was large, she could see that even kneeling. Broad across the shoulders in a way that spoke of real work, not vanity. His hands, even shaking, were a working man's hands. Rope-scarred. Calloused in the right places. He had a knife at his hip, standard frontier issue, but he hadn't reached for it, and she'd been standing in this doorway long enough that if his intentions were wrong, he'd have shown it by now. "Can you stand?" she said. "Yes, ma'am." He couldn't. Not easily. He got his right leg under him, and the left one followed, but he listed sideways, and had to catch himself against the stall gate, and the mare shifted nervously, and he murmured something to the horse low and automatic, a horseman's reflex, and the mare settled. Eleanor noted that too. "Come to the house," she said. Slowly. "If you do anything I don't like, I'll shoot you and bury you behind the barn. I've done it before." He looked at her. Something moved across his face. Not fear. More like a man who had just heard something he recognized. A familiar language spoken in an unfamiliar accent. "I believe you," he said. His name was Caleb Walker. She got that much out of him while he ate because she asked it directly the way she asked everything, and he answered it like a man who'd been asked harder questions and was grateful for an easy one. She gave him beans, bread, water first, then coffee, because she'd learned from nursing Samuel through 2 fever winters that you didn't give a depleted body solid food without liquid to carry it first. She set the food in front of him and sat across the table with her rifle resting across her knees, not pointed at him, just present, and watched him eat. He ate slowly. That surprised her. She had expected the desperate animal feeding of a starving man, and there was desperation in it. Yes, she could see the effort it cost him to not simply shove the bread into his mouth whole, but he ate slowly, deliberately, like a man reminding himself of manners he'd nearly forgotten. "Mountain man," she said. "Guide," he said. "Was." What happened? He looked up from his plate. His eyes were gray, not blue-gray, not green-gray, but the flat, charcoal gray of storm-coming sky. "Lost a group up near the pass last winter. 7 men. I got 4 of them out. And 3 didn't make it." "No, ma'am." "Was it your fault?" He didn't flinch. She respected that. Most men flinched at a question like that out of guilt or pride or both. "Some of it," he said. "Enough of it." Eleanor looked at him. "And since then, you've been doing what exactly? Wandering the mountains, eating pine bark and hoping for the best." Something that wasn't quite a smile crossed his face and disappeared immediately. "I had a camp, trapping, but the spring flood took most everything. Been moving since." "Moving toward what?" "I didn't have a toward," he said. "I was just moving away from the campsite. Seemed important to not stay in the same place." Eleanor understood that perfectly. She had felt the same way for the first 3 months after Samuel's funeral, the desperate need to be in motion, because stillness meant time to think, and time to think meant time to feel, and feeling was something she had placed carefully into a box in the back of her chest, and sealed shut, because she had 32 head of cattle and a leaking barn roof, and 40 acres that did not care how she felt. "You're a long way from any town," she said. 12 miles to Harlan Creek. I know, I counted." "You were walking 12 miles to town in that condition." He looked at his boots. "I was walking 12 miles to town in this condition, yes ma'am. It seemed like a better plan 2 days ago." "What changed?" "I fell down a gully this morning," he said. "Took me 3 hours to climb back out, reassessed my situation." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You can sleep in the barn tonight." He looked up. "Not because I trust you," she said. "Because I am not going to be responsible for a man dying of exposure 12 miles from the nearest town in the middle of summer, which would make me look foolish. You'll sleep in the barn. You'll leave at first light or stay to work. I'll pay you fair wages, or you'll leave whenever you feel able. Those are your options." He looked at her for a moment. "Work," he said. "You sure you haven't heard what the work is?" "Don't matter," he said. "I need to be useful somewhere." He paused. "It matters, to me, being useful." Eleanor looked at him. Really looked at him for the first time since she'd found him in her barn. Not calculating, just looking. There was something in his face she hadn't expected. Not gratitude, though that was there too. Something quieter. The look of a man who had been carrying something so heavy for so long that having someone hand him a legitimate purpose, any purpose, felt like being allowed to set the weight down. Just for a moment, just enough to catch his breath. She stood up. There are blankets in the chest by the barn door. The mare's name is Duchess, and she doesn't like strangers messing with her feet, so don't. There's a pump in the yard for washing. I start work at 4:30. If you're not up, I'm not waking you." She picked up the rifle and walked toward the door. "Mrs. Hayes." She stopped. "Thank you," he said. She didn't turn around. "Eat the rest of that bread. You'll need it." Dear. By the end of the first week, Eleanor had adjusted to the sound of him. She hadn't expected to. She had lived alone for 2 years long enough that every creak of the floorboards had become familiar, that she knew exactly which sound meant wind and which meant something she needed to investigate. Adding another human presence to the property had felt like adding a foreign element, something that would grate against the established rhythm of her days. But Caleb Walker was, she discovered, extraordinarily quiet. Not quiet the way some men were quiet, the performative silence of men who wanted to be noticed for their stoicism. Quiet in a functional way. He didn't announce himself. He didn't make conversation for the sake of filling silence. When he spoke, he had something to say. When he didn't have something to say, he didn't speak. She found it restful in a way she hadn't found anything restful in a long time. He was good with the cattle. Better than she'd expected, she'd hired him, half-skeptically filing the decision under desperate necessity rather than sound judgment. But he moved around the herd with an ease that spoke of deep familiarity, and the animals responded to him. He had a particular way of approaching a nervous steer, slow, diagonal, not direct, that calmed the animal before he'd laid a hand on it. "You grew up with cattle?" she asked on the third day watching him work. "Horses mostly. My father's ranch was horse country." He didn't look up from what he was doing, checking the back fence line for soft posts. "But cattle's not so different." "Where's the ranch now?" "Sold it when I was 20. Father died. Mother went back to her family in Kentucky." He tested a post, found it solid, moved on. "I didn't want to be a rancher." "What did you want to be?" "Didn't know yet." A pause. "Ended up a guide because I was better at mountains than most things. And now—" He stopped, looked at the fence post for a moment. "Now I'm checking fence posts on a widow woman's property in Colorado," he said. "I'll let you know what I think of it once I've been doing it long enough to form an opinion." Eleanor pressed her lips together against something that was not a smile, because she had decided not to smile at him, and went back to the house. Tch. On the 9th day, she found him at Samuel's grave. She came around the corner of the barn and stopped. He was standing in front of the wooden marker, not kneeling, not dramatic, just standing. His hat was off, and in his hands turning slowly by the brim, which was what his hands did when he was thinking. She waited. After a moment, he said without turning, "I didn't know where it was until this morning. I'm sorry if—" "It's all right," she said. He turned then. His face was carefully composed, the expression of a man who had decided not to ask the questions he was thinking. "His name was Samuel," she said, because the marker said Samuel Hayes, and she wasn't explaining anything, she was just stating a fact. "He died of diphtheria, February of '81, 6 days from when he fell sick to when he was gone." Caleb was quiet. "He was a good man," she said. "Not a brilliant one. Not exciting or remarkable. He was solid. He was steady. He did what he said he'd do." She looked at the marker. "That's rarer than people seem to understand." "Yes, ma'am," Caleb said. "It is." "Do you have someone?" she said. "Somewhere?" "No." No hesitation. "I did once." She decided a man who spent 8 months a year in the mountains wasn't a man she wanted to build a life with. She wasn't wrong. Eleanor looked at him. "Does it still hurt?" He considered the question seriously, which she appreciated. "Not like it used to," he said. "It's more like a scar. You know it's there. You don't feel it unless something presses on it." Eleanor nodded. She understood exactly what that felt like. "The barn roof leaks in 2 places," she said. "Northwest corner and above the stall gate. I haven't been able to get up there to fix it. I don't trust the ladder." He put his hat back on. "I'll look at it this afternoon." "Good." She started back toward the house. "And Mr. Walker." Caleb. "The coffee's on," she said. "If you want a cup before you start." She didn't look back. But she heard his footsteps follow her toward the house, and she found herself thinking that the property felt different with him on it. Not safer exactly. She was not a woman who required safety from another person. But different. The way a room felt different when there was a fire in it, not warmer necessarily, just less empty. She went inside and poured 2 cups of coffee, and if she set his down on the table instead of leaving it on the counter, a small thing, a thing that meant sit, stay. This is a place you're allowed to be, she told herself. It was simply efficiency. She was very good at telling herself things. By the end of the 2nd week, Judge Harlan Moss sent a man to the property. Eleanor saw him coming from a 1/4 mile out. She always watched the ridgeline, always knew who was approaching before they arrived, because a woman alone on 40 acres made that habit into a survival skill. The man was riding one of the judge's horses, which she knew by the distinctive white stocking on the left front leg. He was not someone she recognized. She was on the porch when he arrived. She did not stand up. "Mrs. Hayes," the man said without introducing himself. He had the manner of someone who'd been sent to deliver a message and had decided to enjoy the delivery. "Judge Moss sends his regards. He asks me to inform you that the property line hearing has been postponed again. He'll notify you of the new date in due course." "In due course?" Eleanor repeated. "It's been postponed 3 times. "Yes, ma'am. The judge is a busy man." "The judge," Eleanor said evenly, "is stalling because he's already promised that land to Gerard Whitfield, and he's hoping I'll sell before the hearing makes his arrangement inconvenient. You can tell him I said so." The man's manner shifted slightly, hardened at the edges. "That's a serious accusation, Mrs. Hayes." "It's a statement of fact," she said. "Accusations imply uncertainty. I'm not uncertain." From the barn she heard the sound of Caleb setting down tools. She didn't look that direction. She kept her eyes on the judge's man. "The judge also asks," the man said, and his voice had taken on a different quality, now softer, with a particular kind of softness that was its own kind of pressure. "Whether you've given any more thought to his offer. For the property. He's prepared to be generous." "I gave it exactly the thought it deserved," Eleanor said. Which was none. The man looked at her for a long moment. Then his eyes moved past her to the barn, to the figure that had appeared in the doorway. Caleb didn't say anything. He just stood in the barn doorway with his arms crossed, and that flat, gray-eyed stillness that Eleanor was beginning to understand was not absence of emotion, but the opposite emotion compressed down to a point of such density that it simply registered as weight. The man looked at Caleb. Caleb looked back. "You've got help," the judge's man said. His tone had shifted again, recalibrated. "Didn't know you had hired help, Mrs. Hayes." "There are many things you don't know about my property," Eleanor said. "I'd suggest keeping that in mind." The man turned his horse without another word and rode back the way he'd come. Eleanor watched him go. After a moment, Caleb walked up from the barn. He stood beside the porch steps and looked at the retreating rider. "Property dispute," he said. "Judge wants my land. Has for 2 years. He's been finding ways to delay the hearing while he works out how to take it from me legally." "Can he?" "Not if the hearing happens fairly," she said. "Samuel's deed is solid. The survey is clear. But Harlan Moss has been a judge in this county for 11 years and has made a great many friends by being useful to powerful men." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "You need a lawyer." "I need many things," Eleanor said. "Most of them cost money I'm managing carefully." "I know a man in Denver," he said. "Honest one, or was when I knew him 8 years ago. Land law mostly." Eleanor looked at him. "Why would you know a lawyer in Denver?" "One of the men I got out of the mountains, the 4 who made it his brother, was a lawyer. He stayed grateful." Caleb paused. "That's worth something. Maybe." Eleanor looked at him for a long, level moment. "Write him," she said finally. "If you think it's worth the paper." Caleb nodded. He went back to the barn, and Eleanor stayed on the porch long after the dust from the judge's rider had settled, thinking about the word worth, what it meant, who had it, how it was measured, and how strange it was that in 2 years of managing everything alone, not one person had offered her anything practical, anything she could actually use. Just sympathy. Just the slow shake of heads. Just the implication, never quite stated, that a woman alone on 40 acres in the mountains was a problem waiting to happen, and eventually she'd see reason and sell. Caleb Walker had been on her property for 14 days, and already he'd offered her the only useful thing anyone had in 2 years. She went inside. She poured herself a cup of coffee that had gone cold. She drank it anyway, because it was there, because it was real, because she was a woman who dealt with what was in front of her, and what was in front of her was a cold cup of coffee and 40 acres of Colorado mountain land, and a man in her barn who had shown up half dead and turned in 2 weeks into something she hadn't expected. Something that felt dangerously like an asset. She told herself that was all it was. She was very, very good at telling herself things. The letter went out on a Tuesday. Caleb had written it himself at the kitchen table after supper, while Eleanor washed dishes with her back to him and pretended not to notice what he was doing. His handwriting was better than she'd expected, not elegant, but clear. The handwriting of a man who'd had someone teach him correctly and had practiced enough to make it stick. He folded it, sealed it, set it on the table without comment, and went back to the barn. Eleanor picked it up in the morning and took it to town herself because she trusted the Harlan Creek post office slightly more than she trusted leaving anything important unattended, and because she needed flour anyway, and because going to town gave her an opportunity to read the room to see who was watching her, who looked away too quickly, who had clearly had a recent conversation with Judge Moss or Gerard Whitfield that they didn't want her to know about. She had learned to read rooms the way Caleb read mountain weather, quietly, without showing that she was reading anything at all. The post office was fine. The general store was fine. It was on the way back to her wagon that she ran into Whitfield himself. Gerard Whitfield was not a bad-looking man, which was one of the things about him that irritated Eleanor most. He was prosperous and well-dressed, and had the particular confidence of a man who had never in his adult life experienced a consequence he hadn't been able to buy his way around. He owned the largest cattle operation in the county. He wanted her 40 acres because her creek access was the cleanest water source for 10 miles in any direction, and he wanted it the way men like him always wanted things, not because he needed it, but because it was there and he could. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, tipping his hat, "you're looking well." "Mr. Whitfield," she said. "I heard you've taken on a hired hand," he said pleasantly. "Good for you. The property's a lot to manage alone." "I've managed it fine for 2 years." "Of course you have." He smiled. It was a practiced smile, the kind that landed just short of sincerity. "I only meant it must be a relief, to have someone to share the burden." "I'll pass on your concern to my hired hand," Eleanor said. "He'll be moved." Whitfield's smile held, but something behind his eyes adjusted, recalculated. "I wonder if you'd reconsider my offer, Eleanor. I've been generous. I could be more so." "My answer hasn't changed, Mr. Whitfield." "Things change," he said. "Circumstances change. A woman in your position." "In my position," she said, "I own clear title to 40 acres of Colorado land. I have a pending property line hearing, and I am standing on a public street in broad daylight, being pressured by a man who would do better to spend his time managing the property he already has." She picked up her wagon reins. "Good morning." She drove home with her hands steady and her jaw tight, and the particular burning sensation behind her sternum that 2 years of being underestimated had put there like a permanent scar. Caleb was splitting wood when she got back. He looked at her once, just once, a quick assessing glance, and said nothing. But he put the axe down and came to help with the flour without being asked, and she found herself unreasonably grateful for the fact that he didn't say anything, didn't ask, didn't offer comfort she hadn't requested. "Whitfield stopped me in town," she said, because she believed in stating facts. What did he want? The same thing he always wants, phrased more pleasantly. Caleb lifted the flour sack without apparent effort and carried it toward the house. "What did you say?" "What I always say." He nodded, set the sack down inside the door, turned to go back to the wood. "He knows you're here," she said. Caleb stopped. "He made a point of mentioning it," she said. "That he'd heard I had a hired hand. It wasn't casual, it was information. He wanted me to know he was paying attention." Caleb turned back around. His face was doing the thing it did when he was thinking hard. Very still, very neutral, all the processing happening somewhere she couldn't see. "You think that changes his approach?" "I think it changes his timeline," Eleanor said. "Men like Whitfield don't like new variables. They prefer situations they've already mapped out. You being here." She paused. "It complicates his map." "That bother you?" She looked at him. "Complicating Gerard Whitfield's map is the closest thing I've had to entertainment in 2 years. No, it does not bother me." Something crossed Caleb's face. That almost, not quite a smile. Gone before she could name it. He went back to the wood. Eleanor went inside and started on supper, and tried very hard not to notice that having someone to tell things to felt entirely different from simply knowing them alone. She mostly succeeded. The routine built itself the way all necessary things built themselves, not by plan, but by repetition, becoming expectation, becoming need. Caleb was up before 4 every morning. Eleanor knew this because she was up at 4 herself, and every morning when she came out of the house, he had already started whatever the first task of the day was: feeding the stock, checking the fence line, hauling water from the creek when the pump pressure was low. He never explained why he was up that early. She never asked. It was enough that he was. They worked side by side most mornings without speaking, and Eleanor noticed that the silences between them were becoming a different quality of silence. Less the silence of strangers avoiding presumption, and more the silence of two people who had run out of need to fill the air. She noticed this, the way she noticed things she had decided not to examine too closely at an angle, from the corner of her attention. On the 17th day, Caleb's ribs gave him trouble. He didn't say so. He showed no outward sign, or rather, he showed the signs that someone who was trained to look for them could read: a slight shortening of his stride on the right side, the way he favored his left arm when lifting a stillness at the end of the day that went beyond tiredness and into something managed. Eleanor had nursed a man through 2 sick winters. She knew the difference between tired and hurting. She waited until after supper when the dishes were done and the lamps were lit, and Caleb had pushed back from the table in the way that meant he was about to stand up and go to the barn. "Show me your ribs," she said. He went very still. "I'm not asking," she said. "I can see you're favoring them. I need to know whether you need a doctor or whether you're being stubborn about bruising." "I don't need a doctor." "Show me your ribs." A pause. Long enough that she could see him considering whether to argue and deciding against it. He unbuttoned his shirt and lifted it. Eleanor looked at his left side. "That," she said, "is not bruising." 2 of his ribs were visibly displaced, not broken through the skin, but wrong in the way that meant the bone had fractured and shifted. The bruising around them was old purple-yellow, which meant it had happened before he reached her property, before she'd found him in the barn. He had been working on her property for 17 days with 2 fractured ribs and had said nothing. "How," she said very carefully, "did this happen?" "The gully," he said, "when I fell. The gully you fell into the morning before you reached my barn." "Yes, ma'am." Eleanor was quiet for a moment, not because she was angry, or not only because she was angry, but because she was looking at this man who had worked 17 days on her property with 2 fractured ribs and had not said a single word about it, and she was feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time and wasn't entirely sure what to do with. "Sit down," she said. "Mrs. Hayes, it's Caleb." She used his name deliberately. She had been careful with his name, had used it only twice before, and both times precisely. She used it now with the same precision. "Sit down." He sat. She got the kit from the cabinet, the same kit she'd used for Samuel's fevers, and her own hand when she'd cut it badly on a fence wire 6 months ago and hadn't had anyone to help her bandage it. She wrapped his ribs with the efficiency of someone who had learned field medicine out of necessity and had become proficient at it. He didn't make a sound while she worked. She was close to him, close in the practical, unsentimental way of medical necessity, but close, nonetheless close enough to feel the controlled steadiness of his breathing, the deliberate effort he was making to hold still and not make it harder for her. "This is going to take weeks to heal properly," she said. "I know. You should have told me. You needed the help." Eleanor stopped. Just for a moment, just a half-second pause in her hands. Then she kept going. "I have managed this property for 2 years," she said. "I did not need you to manage yourself into permanent injury on my behalf." "I know," he said again. "Then why didn't you say anything?" Silence. Long enough that she looked up from the bandaging to find him looking at the wall, that particular expression of a man choosing words from a limited and carefully guarded supply. "Because you gave me a place to be useful," he said finally. "And I was afraid if you knew I was hurt, you'd tell me to rest. And resting—" He stopped. "Resting is hard for me right now. Harder than the ribs." Eleanor held the end of the bandage and looked at him. She thought about what she knew of Caleb Walker, which was not much in terms of facts, and considerably more in terms of the kind of knowledge that came from watching a person work for 17 days. She thought about the 7 men he'd guided into the mountains, and the 3 he hadn't brought out. She thought about the way he talked about being useful, not as a preference, but as a need. The way some people needed food or water or air. She tied off the bandage, stood up. "You'll work half days for the next 2 weeks," she said. "The fence line in the morning. Nothing that requires lifting above your shoulder. If you try to exceed those limits, I will know, and I will revise the arrangement." He looked at her. "You can't watch me every minute." "I don't need to," she said. "I watched my husband for 8 years. I know what hiding pain looks like." She put the kit away. "Half days." A pause. "Yes, ma'am," he said. She went to bed, and if she lay awake longer than usual, thinking not about the property line or Gerard Whitfield or the leaking barn roof, but about a man who had worked 17 days with fractured ribs because he was afraid of being told to stop. She told herself it was simply the practical concern of an employer for the condition of her workforce. She believed it almost completely. The reply from the Denver lawyer came 3 weeks later, and it was better than either of them had expected. Eleanor read it twice at the kitchen table, while Caleb stood near the door, hat in hand, waiting. She had not invited him to sit because she needed to read it without the distraction of his presence, which was itself a thought she declined to examine. "He'll take the case," she said. "Pro bono initial consultation. He says the Harlan Creek property records are already in dispute in 2 other cases, and if my deed documentation is solid, the hearing outcome is favorable." Caleb nodded slowly. "The deed is solid." "Samuel was meticulous," she said. "He was meticulous about everything." She set the letter down. "He also says there's been a complaint filed against Judge Moss in Denver. Misconduct. I didn't know that." "Harlan would know," Caleb said. "That's why he keeps postponing. He's buying time to see how the complaint resolves." Eleanor looked up. "How do you know that?" "Because that's what a man does when he's got leverage. He's not sure he'll still have next month," he said. "He stalls, makes sure every advantage stays in place before he moves." She looked at him for a moment. "That's a particular kind of knowledge, Caleb. I've known men like Harlan Moss," he said. "Not judges, but men with that kind of relationship to power. You learn to read them." "Where?" He was quiet for a moment. "Some in the mountains, some before that." He shifted his hat brim through his hands. "My father did business with men like that once. Didn't end well for him." It was the most he'd said about his past in 3 weeks. Eleanor filed it, not intrusively, just noted it, placed it in the growing file of things she knew about Caleb Walker and what they added up to. "I'll write back tonight," she said. "I'll send the deed documentation with the next letter." She paused. "Thank you for the contact." "Don't thank me yet," he said. "Thank me if the hearing goes the right way." I'm thanking you for the offer, she said. That's separate. He looked at her. Something in his face shifted, not much, just a small recalibration, like a man who had expected something and gotten something slightly different, and was adjusting his expectations accordingly. He put his hat on and went back to the barn. Eleanor picked up the letter again, read it a third time, and thought not for the first time that the thing about useful people was that you didn't always recognize them until they'd already changed something important. Samuel had been like that. Not dramatic, not declarative, just quietly, consistently present until he wasn't, and the absence of his usefulness had nearly broken her. She was not thinking about Caleb Walker in that context. That was not what she was doing. She folded the letter carefully and put it in the box with Samuel's deed and all the other documents she kept locked and dry and safe, because documents were the things that protected you when everything else failed. And Eleanor Hayes had learned that lesson at a cost she did not intend to pay twice. It was the 1st of August when the horse came back without its rider. Eleanor was on the porch when she saw it one of her neighbor Ben Reardon's horses, a chestnut gelding she recognized by the blaze on its face, coming down the creek road at a walk with the saddle empty and one stirrup dragging. Her stomach dropped before her mind had fully processed what she was seeing. "Caleb," she called. He came out of the barn at a pace that said he'd heard the urgency without her having to explain it. He saw the horse. He was moving before she finished pointing. He caught the gelding easily. The horse was shaken, but not wild, which meant it had been walking a while and had worked most of the panic out. He checked the saddle, checked the gelding's legs, looked at the direction it had come from. "Reardon's place is north," Eleanor said. 3 miles up the creek road. I know." He was already untacking the chestnut and reaching for her bay mare's halter. "I'll go." "I'm coming." "Mrs. Hayes." "Ben Reardon is 62 years old and lives alone, and that horse just came home without him," she said. "I'm coming." He looked at her for 1 second. Then he saddled Duchess without further argument and brought out the older gelding she kept for heavier work and had him saddled in 4 minutes flat, and they rode north together without speaking because there was nothing useful to say. They found Ben Reardon half a mile from his property line on the ground beside the creek, conscious, but barely he'd taken a fall from the horse when it shied at a rattlesnake, and he'd hit the rocky bank hard enough to do something bad to his left leg. He was gray in the face and breathing shallow, and had been lying there for better than 2 hours. "Ben," Eleanor said, kneeling beside him. "Ben, it's Eleanor Hayes." "I know who you are," Ben said with the particular irritability of a hurt man who hadn't lost his mind. "I can see fine my leg's the problem." He looked up at Caleb. "Who's this?" "Caleb Walker," Caleb said. He was already assessing the leg with his hands, gentle, precise. "I'm working the Hayes place. Where does it hurt most?" "Below the knee," Ben said. "And my hip." "But the hip's old. That's not new." "The leg is broken," Caleb said. Not cruel, just direct. "You need to be moved carefully. I'm going to splint it with what we have. It's going to hurt." "Son, I'm 62 years old," Ben said. "Everything hurts. Do what you need to do." Caleb stripped 2 straight branches from the creek bank and used his own belt and Eleanor's kerchief and the leather from Ben's own saddlebag to build a splint that was not elegant and was entirely functional. He worked fast, and his hands were steady, and when Ben gasped and grabbed Eleanor's wrist, Caleb said quietly, "Almost done, sir. You're doing fine," and meant it. Ben made it back to his property on the makeshift travois Caleb rigged from the horses. Caleb got him inside and onto his bed, and Eleanor built the fire up and put water on while Caleb went for the neighbor woman 2 miles further along who functioned as the closest thing the area had to a midwife and general medical practitioner. By the time he got back with the neighbor woman, a steady gray-haired woman named Mrs. Pruitt, who looked at the splint and said, "Better than I'd have done," with what was high praise from her. The crisis had shifted from emergency to management, and Eleanor and Caleb stood in Ben Reardon's yard in the last of the afternoon light, and Eleanor realized her hands were shaking. She noticed it and stopped them, gripped her own elbows and stilled herself by main force of will. "You're all right," Caleb said quietly. I know I'm all right, she said. I'm not shaking from fear. I know. He didn't elaborate on what he thought she was shaking from. Just stood beside her, not close enough to intrude, close enough to be present. He's going to be fine. Mrs. Pruitt knows what she's doing. He's been my neighbor for 6 years, Eleanor said. He brought food when Samuel died. He came himself, didn't send his hands. She stopped. He's a good man. Yes, Caleb said. He is. Silence. The ordinary kind now. The kind that had its own weight and its own comfort. You built that splint very well, Eleanor said. For a mountain guide. Guides do a lot of field medicine, he said. Mountains don't care whether you've got supplies. A pause. Also, one of the men I got out of the pass had 2 broken ribs and a fractured wrist. I learned a great deal on that trip. She looked at him sideways. Is that supposed to make me feel better about the fact that you worked on my property for 17 days with fractured ribs and said nothing? The almost smile again. No, he said. Probably not. Good, she said, because it doesn't. But the sharpness was out of it. They both knew that. They rode back to the Hayes property in the early dark, the horses walking easy and Eleanor's hands steady again. And at the gate, Caleb dismounted and took Duchess's reins without being asked, because that was what he did. He read what was needed without requiring it to be spelled out, and then he did it quietly without announcement. Eleanor went inside. She put the kettle on. A few minutes later, she heard his boots on the porch step. She had already put out 2 cups. Tomorrow, she said when he came in. I want to start checking the north fence line properly. Ben's going to be on his back for weeks, and I don't want cattle wandering between our properties and adding to his trouble. Caleb sat down, wrapped his hands around the cup. Early start. When is it not? 4:30 then. 4, she said. Before the heat. He nodded, drank his coffee. She drank hers, outside the Colorado dark, pressed against the windows full and warm and deep, the way summer dark was in the mountains. Nothing like the thin, mean winter dark that had filled this house when Samuel was dying. This was a live dark, full of crickets and the distant sound of the creek and the occasional call of something moving through the brush on the ridge. Eleanor set her cup down. Caleb, she said. He looked up. You did well today, she said. With Ben, you did. She stopped. That was good work. He looked at her for a moment. Something in his face opened slightly, not dramatically, not in a way that would embarrass either of them, just a small quiet easing, like a fist unclenching one finger at a time. Thank you, he said. Simple, quiet. She stood up and took her cup to the basin. 4 o'clock, she said. 4 o'clock, he said. She went to her room, and if she stood inside her closed door for a moment before she moved to the lamp, if she stood there and pressed her hand flat against the wood and felt the solid reality of it, and thought about the fact that on the other side of her house there was someone who had done good work today and meant it, and expected nothing from her for saying so, she stayed there only a moment, only long enough to understand that something had shifted without her permission. And then she moved to the lamp and turned it down and told herself it was only the difficulty of the day catching up with her. She was very good at telling herself things. She was becoming, she suspected, slightly less good at believing them. The north fence line took 4 days. Not because it was that long. 3 miles of fence between the Hayes property and Ben Reardon's grazing land was a half-day job under normal circumstances, but because 2 seasons of deferred maintenance had turned it into a project rather than a task. Posts rotted. Wire pulled loose from the staples. 3 sections had collapsed entirely under the weight of a winter she'd had no one to help her reinforce against. Caleb worked without complaint. Eleanor worked beside him. By the 2nd day, she had stopped explaining what needed to be done, and he had stopped waiting to be told. They moved along the fence line with a rhythm that had developed without discussion, each reading what the next section needed before they reached it, dividing the work without debate. It was on the 3rd day that Eleanor made a mistake. Not a bad mistake, not a dangerous one. She was setting a post anchor, and her foot slipped on the loose creek bank, and she went down hard on one knee, and before she had fully registered what had happened, Caleb's hand was at her elbow, not grabbing, not catching dramatically, just there. Steady, present. She stood up on her own. But his hand was there for the half second it took her to find her footing, and then it was gone, and neither of them said anything about it, and they kept working. That night Eleanor sat at the kitchen table for a long time after supper, hands around a cup of coffee gone cold, and thought about the weight of a hand at an elbow. She thought about how long it had been since anyone had touched her casually, not medically, not deliberately. Just the ordinary, unremarkable contact of someone present enough to catch you when you slipped. 2 years. 2 years and 4 months to be exact since Samuel had last put his hand on her arm. She poured the cold coffee out and went to bed and did not think about it anymore. She was exceedingly good at not thinking about things. They finished the fence on a Thursday, and by Friday the work had moved to the barn roof, which Caleb had been quietly preparing for without announcement. Eleanor came out in the morning to find he had already gotten the lumber she'd ordered from Harlan Creek 2 weeks ago, and staged it beside the barn, and had the ladder braced and tested. "You checked the ladder," she said. "It's solid," he said. "I reinforced the base. It was wobbling on the left side." She looked at the ladder, then at him. "I could have done that." "I know," he said. "I did it because it was there, and I was up." Eleanor said nothing, but she noted as she noted everything the manner of it. Not possessive, not demonstrating competence for her benefit. Just a man who saw a thing that needed doing and did it the same way she did, without theater. She went up the ladder first on principle. He followed without comment. They worked on the roof through the morning, and it was up there, moving carefully across the old cedar shingles with the Colorado mountains spread in every direction, and the summer heat already building, that Caleb said, without looking at her, "I got a letter from Denver this morning, with yours." Eleanor went still. "From the lawyer. From his office. My mail is forwarded to the Harlan Creek post office." He paused, setting a shingle with precision. "The complaint against Judge Moss was upheld. He's been placed under formal review by the Territorial Judicial Board." Eleanor set down the hammer she was holding, very carefully. "That's—" She stopped, recalibrated. Notice went out 2 days ago, effective immediately. He's not permitted to hear any case with active conflict of interest allegations pending the review." Caleb looked at her then. "Your property hearing qualifies." "The hearing will be reassigned," Eleanor said, "to a different judge. One Moss hasn't had 11 years to cultivate." He turned back to the shingle. "You should write to the Denver lawyer today." Eleanor sat on the barn roof in the August heat and felt something she had not felt in 2 years, and was so unfamiliar with that, it took her a moment to identify it. Relief. Real relief. Not the functional, managed relief of a crisis averted, but something deeper. The physical loosening of something that had been clenched in her chest for so long she had stopped noticing the tension, and started thinking the tightness was just how her chest felt. "Eleanor," Caleb said. She realized she hadn't spoken. "I'm all right," she said. "I know you are." He handed her the next shingle without making the moment larger than it was. "Keep moving. We'll lose the good light." She took the shingle, went back to work, but she was aware in a way she hadn't been before of the distance between them on the roof, 4 feet, maybe 5, and the fact that it felt both exactly right and slightly too far. And that was a thought she filed and locked and placed firmly in the box at the back of her chest, beside everything else she was managing carefully. Chuck. She wrote the letter to Denver that evening. Caleb sat across the table and drank coffee while she wrote, and he didn't read over her shoulder, and he didn't offer to help, and the comfortable ordinariness of his presence while she worked was something she was rapidly losing the ability to pretend she didn't notice. She sealed the letter and set it down. "There's something I should tell you," she said. He looked up. "When Samuel was sick, she said there were people in town who thought I should sell, before he died, while he was still ill. Men who came to the property and spoke to me about realistic expectations and practical decisions, while my husband was dying 20 feet away." She looked at the letter in her hands. Whitfield was one of them. He didn't come himself. He sent a representative, which I found more insulting than if he'd come himself. Caleb said nothing, waiting. I didn't sell, she said. Obviously. And after Samuel died, I told myself I was keeping the property because it was mine, and because Samuel had worked for it, and because I was not going to reward the kind of men who circled dying situations like... She stopped. But the truth is more complicated than that. It usually is, Caleb said. I kept it because if I let it go, I didn't know what was left, she said. The ranch was what I did. It was what I was for out here. If I sold and went back to Ohio, or wherever I was supposed to go, I would have been... She paused. I would have been just a widow. Just a woman whose situation had not worked out. Caleb put his cup down. His voice when he spoke was quiet and entirely without performance. And now... Eleanor looked at him. Now it's mine, she said. Not because I have nothing else, because I chose it. There's a difference. He looked at her for a long moment. Yes, he said, there is. The lamplight between them was steady and warm. I thought you should know that, Eleanor said. Why the land matters, what the hearing means. She stood up. Good night, Caleb. Good night, he said. She went to her room and sat on the edge of her bed and pressed both hands flat on her knees and breathed slowly, deliberately, the way she breathed through anything that required steadiness, and thought about the fact that she had just told Caleb Walker something she had never told anyone. Not the Denver lawyer. Not Ben Reardon, who was her closest neighbor and the closest thing she had to a friend in this county. She had told him because he had asked now. Because the question had been genuine, not polite. Because he asked things like he actually wanted to know the answers, which in her experience was rarer than most people would admit. She went to sleep, and for the first time in longer than she could calculate, she slept straight through to 4 o'clock without waking in the dark, to the sound of her own thoughts. The morning Ben Reardon came to the property on a borrowed crutch was the morning everything changed. Eleanor saw him coming from the porch and went out to meet him, because a 62-year-old man with a broken leg and a crutch had no business making a 3-mile round trip on foot unless he had something that couldn't wait for her to come to him. His face told her before his words did. There were men at your fence line last night, he said. North end near the creek. I saw them from my upper window. I've been sleeping light, the leg wakes me. 3 men. They weren't ranchers. Eleanor's face didn't change. Did you recognize them? One of them I've seen in town. He rides with Whitfield's outfit. The other 2 I don't know. Ben's voice was tight and angry in the way of men who were angry on behalf of someone else. They weren't doing anything. Just looking, walking the fence line, checking. Checking, Eleanor said. Like men who'd been sent to look at something before they did something to it, Ben said. I've seen that before. In '74, before the Kellerman place burned. Men walked that fence for 3 nights before the fire. Eleanor stood very still. Ben looked at her with the directness of someone who has decided that kindness requires honesty. Eleanor, these men are not going to let the hearing happen if they can prevent it. Not now that Moss is out of it. Whitfield needs that land, and he knows a fair hearing doesn't give it to him. I know, she said. You need to be careful, Ben said. More careful than you have been. And your man... He glanced toward the barn. He needs to know, she told Caleb while he was sharpening the fence wire cutters in the barn, because there was no point in making it a formal conversation. Formal conversations implied that she was uncertain how to say a thing, and she was not uncertain. She told him plainly, the way she told him everything, and she watched his hands stop moving on the wire cutters and stay very still. 3 men, he said. Ben doesn't know the other 2. Whitfield has hired men for this kind of work before, Caleb said. Not a question. He said it like a man who had already thought about this possibility and had been waiting for confirmation. Apparently, she said. He set the wire cutters down, turned to face her fully. I want to move my bedroll to the hayloft tonight. Eleanor looked at him. Not for... He stopped, started again. The hayloft gives a view of the north fence line from the high window, and the creek road, If anyone comes onto this property at night, I'll hear them before they reach the house." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. In her chest, the thing she had been managing was doing something complicated. Gratitude tangled with something else. Something that had to do with the fact that he had said this property and not your property. And she was not sure when that had changed or what it meant that she had noticed. "All right," she said. "I'll need a lantern with a shutter," he said. "And your rifle needs to be by your bed, not on the wall rack." "It's been by my bed since the first week of Samuel's illness," she said. "I'm not a woman who needs to be told to arm herself." A flicker of something in his eyes. "No," he said. "You're not." She went back to the house. That night, she lay in her bed with the rifle on the floor beside her, and the window cracked an inch, and listened to the Colorado dark. And it was different from all the other nights she'd listened to it, because somewhere above her in the hayloft, there was a man who was also listening. She slept badly, not from fear, from the awareness of not being alone in the listening. Church. 3 nights passed without incident. On the 4th night at 2 in the morning, she heard the loft door. Eleanor was awake before she'd consciously decided to be rifle in hand. Feet on the floor, heart rate elevated but controlled. She heard footsteps cross the yard below, not trying to be silent, which meant either carelessness or an announcement, and then Caleb's voice low from the yard. "Eleanor, come out, quietly." She put on her boots and her coat and went out. He was standing at the corner of the barn, and in the pale moonlight, his face was set in that compressed stillness she had learned to read as contained alarm. He pointed north without speaking. She looked. A light. Moving along the north fence line. Slow and deliberate. A lantern, maybe, or a torch swinging slightly with the gait of the person carrying it. And behind it, barely visible, 2 more. "They're walking the fence again," she said. "They're not walking," Caleb said quietly. "Look at the second one, his hands." She looked. The second figure was doing something, stopping, bending, working at something at ground level. "Wire cutters," Caleb said. Eleanor's grip tightened on the rifle. "They're cutting the north fence," he said. "If the fence is down at the creek crossing, your cattle will move onto Reardon's land by morning. It won't look like sabotage, it'll look like poor maintenance. When Whitfield's men report it, and they will, it becomes evidence that you can't manage the property. For a judge reviewing the case for the first time, it plants doubt." Eleanor understood immediately. It was elegant and vicious, and exactly the kind of move that a man like Whitfield would make, not dramatic, not criminal in any obvious way, just corrosive, just effective. "I'm going up there," she said. "We," Caleb said. She looked at him. "Eleanor." His voice was quiet and very level. 3 men. In the dark. You're a good shot. And you're not afraid. And neither of those things changes the arithmetic." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded. They went up the creek road together, and the night felt different with him beside her, not safer in the way she had always distrusted, not the safety of someone covering her weakness, but the safety of doubled arithmetic. 2 sets of eyes. 2 sets of hands. 2 people who had both in their separate histories been alone in situations that required more than one person, and had survived them and knew exactly what the alternative felt like. The 3 men didn't see them coming. Caleb moved wide to the left, and Eleanor went straight up the road, and the first man turned and brought his lantern up and said, "Who's?" And Eleanor said, "Get off my land." And the sound of her voice in the dark was entirely without panic or theater. It was the voice she used for facts. The man with the lantern stepped back. He was younger than she'd expected, mid-20s maybe, with the look of someone who'd been hired for this job and was rapidly reconsidering its appeal. "Mrs. Hayes," he said. He knew her name, which meant Whitfield had briefed them. "We're just checking the fence line." "At 2 in the morning," Eleanor said. "We were passing." "You've cut 4 sections of wire," she said. "I can see them from here. That is criminal destruction of property, and I will see you in front of a judge for it. And given that the current judge reviewing cases in this county has no established relationship with Gerard Whitfield, I am confident about the outcome." She raised the rifle slightly. Not aimed, just present. "Get off my land. Take your wire cutters. Don't come back." The second man, the one with the wire cutters, was looking past Eleanor, looking at Caleb, who had come up on the left and was standing still in the moonlight with his arms at his sides, and that quality of concentrated stillness that Eleanor had learned to read, but that these men were reading now for the first time. She watched the second man make a decision. He dropped the wire cutters. The sound of them hitting the rocky ground was loud and very final. "Whitfield won't be happy," the first man said. He was trying to recover something, dignity maybe, or the appearance of purpose. "Whitfield," Eleanor said, "is not the person you should be worrying about tonight." The third man, who had not spoken at all, turned and walked back the way they'd come. The other two followed him. Not running, that would be too direct an admission of what they were, but walking fast in the particular way of men who have realized they've badly miscalculated something. Eleanor didn't move until she couldn't hear their footsteps anymore. Then she lowered the rifle and stood in the dark for a moment, and felt the night settle back around her. The crickets had gone silent during the confrontation. Now slowly they started up again. The creek moved over its stones. The mountains in every direction held their dark bulk against the sky. Caleb came to stand beside her. She was shaking. She noticed it at the same moment he probably did, a fine tremor in her hands, not dramatic, just present. "I'm all right," she said before he could say it. "I know," he said. Neither of them moved. "I was not afraid," she said. "I know that too," he said. "I hate this," she said. Quiet. Tight. "I hate that they come here and that they think they can—" She stopped. Breathed. "This is Samuel's land. He is buried 20 feet from that barn, and these men came here in the dark with wire cutters and—" "Eleanor," Caleb said. She stopped. He turned toward her, not reaching for her, not presuming, just turning so that she was not alone in the dark with whatever she was feeling. "They left," he said. "Your fence is cut, but it's fixable. Your cattle haven't moved yet. By morning we'll have the wire repaired, and there will be nothing to show for this except 3 men with a story they can't tell Whitfield without admitting they failed." She breathed. "You're right," she said. "I know." She almost laughed. The almost laugh surprised her, surprised him too, from the slight shift in his expression. "Don't get smug," she said. "I wouldn't dare," he said. They walked back down the creek road together, and they repaired the wire by lantern light. All 4 cut sections working side by side, saying very little. And when they were done, Eleanor set down her fence pliers and looked at the repaired line in the pale pre-dawn light and felt something crystallize inside her. This was hers. All of it. The fence and the cattle and the barn and Samuel's grave and the leaking roof now repaired, and the letter to Denver now sent, and the north fence line now standing. And Caleb Walker, who had slept in her hayloft to watch her fence line, and had walked up a dark road with her at 2 in the morning, not to protect her, but to balance the arithmetic. That was different. She had been protected before in the way that was really about the protector's need to feel important. This was different. This was simply someone who showed up. She picked up the lantern and turned toward the house. "Thank you," she said. Simply. Without qualification. Caleb gathered the tools. "We should get the cattle checked before first light," he said. "Make sure none of them found the gap before we repaired it." "I'll saddle up," she said. "I'll get the wire count," he said, and they went back to work because that was what they did, and because the Colorado dark was beginning to soften at its eastern edges into the first pale suggestion of morning, and because there were cattle to check and a property to run and a hearing coming that Eleanor Hayes intended to win. She intended to win everything now. She wasn't sure exactly when that had changed from determination into something that felt more like certainty. But she thought, without allowing herself to think it too directly, that it had something to do with the weight of a hand at an elbow, and a man in a hayloft, and wire repaired by lantern light at 3 in the morning, by 2 people who had both in their separate histories been alone in the dark, and were not anymore. The report came from Ben Reardon on a Monday. He sent it by way of his ranch hand, a boy of 16 named Tommy, who arrived at the Hayes property at a hard gallop and was already talking before he'd fully stopped his horse. Eleanor came off the porch, and Caleb came out of the barn, and they both stood in the yard listening to Tommy deliver Ben's message in the breathless, urgent way of someone who understood the stakes, even if he didn't understand all the details. The hearing had been scheduled. 30 days out. New judge, a man named Aldrich out of Denver with a reputation for running a clean courtroom and a notable lack of patience for procedural delays. The Denver lawyer had confirmed it in a letter that had arrived at Ben's place, forwarded from the post office, because Ben had been going to town on his crutch every few days and had quietly made himself Eleanor's informal mail relay. "Mr. Reardon says congratulations," Tommy said, catching his breath. "And he says to tell you the judge is a fair one. He's heard of him." Eleanor stood in the yard and let the information settle. 30 days. A real hearing. A judge who hadn't spent 11 years being cultivated by men like Harlan Moss. "Tell Ben thank you," she said, "and tell him to stay off that leg." Tommy grinned and turned his horse and was gone at the same hard gallop. Eleanor looked at Caleb. 30 days, she said. "Plenty of time," he said, "for the documentation to be organized and forwarded to Denver." "And for Whitfield to try something else," she said. Caleb looked at her. "Yes," he said. "For that too." Neither of them said anything more about it. But she noticed that after Tommy left, Caleb began moving through his days with a particular quality of attention that she recognized from the night of the fence, that compressed, outward-facing alertness of a man who had decided that something was coming and was arranging himself to meet it. She found it both reassuring and unsettling. Reassuring because she trusted his instincts. Unsettling because she trusted them enough that his alertness made her own sharpen, and spending 30 days in that state of sharpened alertness was exhausting to contemplate. She wrote to the Denver lawyer that evening. Caleb sat across the table and said nothing, and she found, as she had found every other time she'd written at that table with him present, that his silence was not empty. It was the silence of someone paying attention without intruding, which was so rare in her experience that she'd stopped taking it for granted somewhere around the 3rd week. She sealed the letter, looked at it. "I want to ask you something," she said. He looked up. "When this is over," she said, "when the hearing is done and the property line is settled and Whitfield has run out of legal angles." She paused, chose words carefully. "What do you want to do?" Caleb was still for a moment. "You mean, do I intend to leave?" "I mean, what do you want?" she said. "That's a different question." He looked at his coffee cup for a moment. Then he looked at her, and when Caleb Walker looked directly at a person, it was different from how most people looked. There was no social performance in it, no management of impression. He just looked. "I want to stay," he said. "If there's a place for me here, I want to stay." Eleanor held his gaze. "There's a place for you here," she said, simple, undecorated. She said it the way she said everything that mattered as a fact, not a sentiment. Caleb nodded once. "Then I'll stay." She stood up and took the letter to the cabinet where she kept the outgoing mail. "Same wages," she said from across the room, "plus the barn." "That's fine," he said. "Don't think it's anything more than practical," she said. A pause. "I don't," he said. But when she turned back to the table, his coffee cup was empty, and he was almost smiling, and she decided not to address it because she had a letter to mail in the morning and 30 days of preparation ahead of her, and she was a woman who dealt with one thing at a time. The 2nd week after the hearing was scheduled was when Whitfield made his next move, and it came from a direction Eleanor had not anticipated. She was in town, the general store collecting supplies, and the week's mail, when she heard her name spoken by a voice she didn't immediately place. She turned. The woman was perhaps 50, well-dressed by Harlan Creek standards, with the careful presentation of someone who spent time on it. Eleanor recognized her. After a moment, Margaret Hollis, wife of the county clerk, a woman she had exchanged pleasantries with perhaps 6 times in her 12 years in Colorado, and had no strong opinion of either way. "Mrs. Hayes," Margaret said. I'm glad I caught you. I've been meaning to. I wanted to speak with you privately. She glanced around the store with the slightly theatrical subtlety of someone who wanted to be seen having a private conversation. I've heard some things. About your situation. About your hired man. Eleanor went very still. What about him? I don't want to. I'm only telling you because I think you should know what's being said. Margaret lowered her voice. Mr. Whitfield has been speaking to people. About the man staying on your property. About how it looks. A widow woman alone with a strange man living in her barn. There are people saying it isn't appropriate. That it reflects on your... She paused. On your character. As a woman. Eleanor looked at her for a long moment. The particular cold that spread through her chest was not surprise. She had lived long enough and known enough men like Whitfield to understand that when legal and physical tactics failed, character was next. It was always next. And for a woman, character meant one thing above all others, because that was the one weapon that was always available against a woman who wouldn't be moved. Margaret, she said. Who specifically is Mr. Whitfield speaking to? The circuit minister, some of the older families. He's suggesting that the court might take note of... He's suggesting, Eleanor said very evenly, that a judge considering a property dispute might discount the testimony and documentation of a widow if that widow's virtue can be called into question. Is that what you're telling me? Margaret looked uncomfortable. I'm telling you what I've heard. I thought you should know. And what do you think? Eleanor said. You personally. Do you believe there is anything inappropriate about a woman employing a man to work her property? A pause. No, Margaret said quietly. I don't. Then I appreciate you telling me, Eleanor said. And I appreciate your honest answer. She paid for her supplies and walked out of the store and loaded her wagon and drove home and did not allow her face to change through any of it, because she was in a public space, and public spaces were not the place for feelings. Public spaces were for information gathering and performance of composure. She held the composure the entire 12 miles home. She came in through the gate, and Caleb was at the fence, and he took one look at her face, at whatever her face was doing, despite her best efforts, and set down what he was doing, and walked over. What happened? He said. Not are you all right? Not what's wrong, just what happened. Like a man who assumed she was capable of handling whatever it was and only needed to know the facts. She told him, plainly, directly, the same way she'd have told him about the fence or the cattle or the hearing date. When she finished, Caleb's jaw was tight. He's trying to discredit you before the hearing, he said. Yes. By using me. His voice was flat, not angry or not only angry, something under the anger, something that looked like guilt. By using the fact that you're here, Eleanor said. That's not the same as using you. Eleanor. He stopped. If I'm making this harder for you, if my being here is giving him a weapon, don't, she said sharply. He stopped. Don't offer to leave, she said. That is exactly what he wants. He wants you gone so that I am alone and the fence fails and the cattle drift, and by the time the hearing comes, I look like a woman who can't manage her property. Leaving is not an option. He looked at her. I wasn't only thinking about the property, he said. The quietness of it landed differently than she'd expected. She met his eyes and held them for a moment long enough that she felt something in the space between them shift, the way air shifted before a storm, some change in pressure that you felt in your body before you could name it. Neither was I, she said. Then she went inside. She heard him stand in the yard for a moment. Then she heard him go back to the fence, and Eleanor Hayes stood at her kitchen window and pressed both hands flat on the counter and breathed and thought that the most dangerous thing Gerard Whitfield had done, more dangerous than the men with the wire cutters, more dangerous than the postponed hearings, more dangerous than any of it was, force her to say out loud that she did not want Caleb Walker to leave, because saying things out loud made them real in a way that thinking them did not, and real things could be taken from you. She knew that better than anyone. The letter from the Denver lawyer arrived 10 days later and was not entirely good news. It was good in the ways that mattered. The documentation was solid. The hearing was confirmed. Judge Aldrich had a record of ruling on the side of clear deed documentation in 5 of the 6 land disputes he'd heard in the last 3 years. But attached to the lawyer's letter was a separate notice forwarded from the territorial court, and this one made Eleanor sit down. Whitfield had filed a counterclaim. Not on the property line on the property itself. He was contesting Samuel's original deed on the grounds of what the filing called irregularities in the survey record, which Eleanor recognized immediately as the kind of language that meant someone had gone through 14-year-old documents looking for any minor inconsistency that could be inflated into a question. The lawyer's letter said the counterclaim was weak. He said probably weak, which was lawyer language for I am not certain. A probably weak counterclaim before a judge she'd never appeared before was not the same as no counterclaim at all. Eleanor put the letters on the table and called Caleb in from the yard and showed them to him without comment. He read both letters, carefully. He read the way he did everything without rushing, without performing reaction. Then he set them down. He's desperate, Caleb said. Desperate men do more damage than confident ones, Eleanor said. The survey irregularity, he said. Do you know what he's referring to? I think so. She got up and went to the cabinet and took out the box, the locked box with Samuel's deed and the documents. She found the survey record, spread it on the table. There's a discrepancy in the boundary description. Here, she pointed. The original survey says northwest corner established at the second Ponderosa east of the creek bend. The county record says northwest corner established at the large Ponderosa east of the creek bend. Second versus large. Caleb looked at the records. Are there 2 Ponderosas at the creek bend? There were, she said. In 1869. The smaller one fell in the winter of 72. It's not there anymore. So the physical marker the deed references no longer exists. The stump is there, she said. It's clearly a tree stump. But Whitfield could argue that without the second tree, the boundary marker is ambiguous. And ambiguous means a judge has to interpret. She looked at the documents. A judge who didn't know this land who was seeing it for the first time. He'd need someone to testify to where the boundary actually is, Caleb said. Someone who knew the land before 1872, who could confirm the stump is the right stump and its location. Eleanor looked up. Ben Reardon has been on his property since 1868. He's watched that tree line his entire tenure here. He helped Samuel clear the north section in 1871. She paused. He'd remember. Have you asked him? I haven't needed to. Until now. Caleb straightened. I'll go see him today, he said. Explain what we need. He can give a written statement for the lawyer before the hearing. Eleanor looked at him. You don't need to. You need to stay here, Caleb said. You need to organize the rest of this documentation and write to the lawyer about the survey. I can ride to Ben's and back in 2 hours. He paused. Unless you'd rather go yourself. I'd rather go myself, she said honestly. But you're right that the documentation needs to go out today, and I can't do both. He was already getting his coat. Caleb, she said. He stopped. Tell Ben. She paused. Tell him I'm grateful, and that I'll get over to see him properly once this is resolved. I'll tell him, Caleb said. He left, and Eleanor sat at the table with Samuel's documents spread around her and worked through them with a systematic attention that would have looked to an outside observer like a woman entirely in command of her situation, which she was. She was also underneath that command frightened in a way she hadn't been since Samuel's fever climbed past 104, and she'd understood for the first time that efficiency and determination and will were not always enough. That sometimes the world simply moved against you regardless of what you deserved. She had lost Samuel anyway. She was not going to lose the land. She set her jaw and kept working. Caleb came back from Ben's with more than a written statement. He came back with Ben Reardon himself, leg and crutch, and all seated on the wagon bench with Tommy driving, and an expression of determined stubbornness on his face that dared anyone to suggest he should have stayed home. Ben, Eleanor said, coming out to the yard. I'm not writing it down, Ben said before she could speak. I'll come to the hearing and say it in person. I've been saying I wanted to see the inside of a proper courtroom for 30 years and my leg's not going to stop me. He climbed down from the wagon with Tommy's help and the careful dignity of a man who was in significant pain and refusing to acknowledge it. Besides, he said, I want to look the new judge in the eye when I tell him I watched Samuel Hayes plant that survey stake myself in October of 1869. In the dark, nearly because we ran long. I brought the lantern. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. You were there, she said. Of course I was there. We were neighbors before you arrived. Samuel needed 4 hands to set the corner stakes properly, and his hired man had quit that month. I helped him. Ben's voice was matter-of-fact. I can describe exactly where each stake went. The northwest corner stake was at the second Ponderosa, the smaller one because Samuel said it had a distinctive lean to the east that would make it easy to find. The larger one was too close to the creek to be a reliable marker. He looked at her steadily. The stump of that smaller Ponderosa is 30 feet north of where Whitfield's men put their survey flag last spring. I measured it. With Tommy. Eleanor looked at Tommy, who nodded. Yes, ma'am. I can say so too if it helps. I measured it. Eleanor stood in her yard in the Colorado August heat and looked at these 2 men, 62 years old, with a broken leg, and 16 years old, with a horse. He rode too fast and felt something move through her chest that she was too well defended to call by its right name. But that felt very much like the specific pain of being grateful when you had spent 2 years telling yourself you didn't need anyone. Come inside, she said. Both of you. She made coffee. Ben and Tommy stayed 3 hours while Eleanor and Caleb drafted the detailed statement for the Denver lawyer Ben, talking Eleanor writing Caleb, asking the specific questions that pinned down the precise details a court would require. When they left, the statement was complete and notarized with Ben's signature and Tommy's as a secondary witness. Caleb walked Ben to the wagon. Eleanor stood on the porch and watched them go, and she heard Ben say something to Caleb too low for her to make out. And she saw Caleb nod, and Ben put a hand briefly on Caleb's arm in the manner of an older man communicating something he considered important. And then Tommy was helping Ben up onto the wagon bench, and they were gone down the creek road. She waited until Caleb came back to the porch. What did he say to you? She said. Caleb stopped on the bottom step. He said he was glad I was here. Eleanor looked at him. He said, Caleb paused. He said Samuel was a good man and that he'd been worried about you, after, and that it did him good to see you weren't alone anymore. Eleanor didn't say anything for a moment. He said that, she said finally. Yes. She looked at the road where the wagon had gone. He's a good man, she said. Yes, Caleb said. He is. She went inside. She got halfway to the kitchen before she stopped in the middle of the room and stood very still with her hands at her sides. Not crying. Eleanor Hayes was not a woman who cried easily or often, and this was not one of the times she did. But there was pressure behind her eyes and a particular heaviness in her throat that she recognized as emotion she was processing without full permission. He'd been worried about her. After. She had known this in the abstract, had known that people worried had heard it in the carefully phrased concern of the women in town, had seen it in Ben's face on the occasions she'd run into him in the first terrible year. But she had been so busy managing, so entirely occupied with surviving and working, and not letting the land or the cattle or the fences fail, she had not let herself know how alone she had looked from the outside, how frightening her solitude had been to people who cared about her. How much of her independence had been visible not as strength, but as a woman refusing help she desperately needed. She stood in the middle of her kitchen and felt the weight of 2 years of managed solitude settle on her all at once. Then she heard Caleb's boots on the porch. She moved, got to the stove, put the kettle on with hands that were steady and a spine that was straight and a face that showed nothing except the ordinary composure of a woman who had decided what the next task was. Caleb came in. He looked at her, just looked, that flat, honest, unperformative attention he brought to everything. You all right? He said. Fine, she said. A pause. "Eleanor," he said. She turned to look at him. He was just inside the door, not close, not crowding her, just standing in her kitchen in the late afternoon light, with his hat in his hands, and that particular expression she had learned to read, as a man working up to something he wasn't sure would be welcome. "You don't have to be fine," he said. "You're allowed to not be fine sometimes." She looked at him for a long moment. "I know that," she said. "I'm not sure you do," he said. Quiet. Not challenging. Just said. Eleanor held his gaze. And the thing that had been building in her chest for weeks, the thing she had filed and locked and managed and organized, and firmly refused to examine pressed against its container in a way it had not done before. "I know it," she said again, more quietly. "I'm just out of practice." He nodded. Set his hat on the peg by the door, not asking permission, just doing it, the gesture of a man who had decided this was a place he belonged. "The hearing's in 20 days, he said. "The documentation is solid. Ben's statement is solid. You're going to win this." She looked at her hands on the stove handle. "And if I don't?" "Then you fight it again," he said. "And I'll still be here." The simplicity of it landed in her chest like something solid, like a post anchor, like a stake driven into ground. Still here. She turned back to the kettle, poured 2 cups, set his on the table in the place that had become, without any formal designation, his place at her table. 20 days, she said. 20 days, he said. He sat down. She sat down across from him. Outside, the Colorado summer moved through its long afternoon unhurried and indifferent, the way it had moved through every afternoon of the 2 years she'd spent alone, but it didn't feel the same as those afternoons. It felt different in the way that rooms felt different with a fire in them. Not warmer necessarily, just less empty. And Eleanor Hayes, who was very good at telling herself things, found that she had run out of things to tell herself. So she drank her coffee and let the afternoon be what it was. The morning of the hearing, Eleanor was up at 3. Not because she'd set herself to wake at 3, because she hadn't slept past 3, hadn't really slept at all past midnight, if she was being honest with herself, which she was trying to be more of. She lay in her bed and listened to the Colorado dark and went through the documentation in her head the way she went through fence line, methodically post by post, checking for weakness. The deed. Solid. The survey record with Ben's corrected notation. Solid. Ben's signed statement with Tommy's secondary witness signature. Solid. The Denver lawyer's brief, which had arrived 4 days ago and which she had read 7 times. Solid. She got up at 3 and dressed and went to the kitchen and put the kettle on, and she was not surprised when she heard the loft door and then Caleb's boots on the porch steps. He came in without knocking. He hadn't knocked in 3 weeks, and she hadn't told him to because the absence of that particular formality had happened naturally, and she'd decided not to disturb natural things. He sat down. She poured 2 cups. Neither of them said anything for a while. "You slept," she said finally. It wasn't a question. "Some," he said. "Good." She wrapped her hands around her cup. "One of us should be rested." He looked at her. "You're going to win today, Eleanor." "I know," she said. "Then why?" "Because knowing doesn't stop the feeling," she said. "I know it's going to be fine. I also know that Samuel knew he was strong and healthy in October of 1880 and was dead by February. Knowing things doesn't make you immune to what can happen." She paused. "I'm allowed to be anxious." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "You are." "Don't agree with me so easily," she said. "It's unsettling." "Would you prefer I argue?" "I'd prefer you drink your coffee," she said. "We leave at 6. He drank his coffee, and she sat across from him in her kitchen at 3 in the morning and felt underneath the anxiety and the documentation review and the careful composure, something that she recognized now that she had stopped pretending not to recognize. A settled warmth. The particular comfort of not being the only person awake. She had been the only person awake for 2 years and 4 months. She was not anymore. "Butter," They rode to Harlan Creek together with Ben and Tommy in Ben's wagon a quarter-mile behind them, because Ben had insisted on coming in his own vehicle and at his own pace, despite Eleanor's offer to arrange something more comfortable. The morning was cool and dry, the way Colorado August mornings were, before the heat built, and the horses moved easily on the creek road, and Eleanor rode with her back straight and her hands quiet on the reins. Caleb rode beside her without speaking. He was good at that, being present without filling the space with words that weren't needed. She had come to depend on it more than she'd planned. "Tell me something," she said when they were 2 miles out from town. "What kind of something?" "Something that isn't about the hearing," she said. He thought about it for a moment. "When I was 23, he said, "I guided my first group alone. 3 men elk hunting 10 days in the Rockies. First night out, I got us so thoroughly lost that I didn't sleep for 30 hours trying to find our position. Found it eventually. The men never knew we'd been off course." Eleanor glanced at him. "How did you find it?" "Followed the water down," he said. "Water always knows where it's going." She thought about that. "That's either wise or obvious." "Out there it's the same thing," he said. She almost smiled. She let herself this time. "Did you ever get lost again?" "Yes," he said. "But never the same way twice." She looked at the road ahead. "Is that supposed to be comforting?" "It's supposed to be true," he said. Comforting wasn't the goal. "No," she said. "I suppose not." They rode the last 2 miles in silence. But it was a different silence from the silences of the first weeks, not the silence of strangers avoiding presumption, but the silence of 2 people who had found without planning to a language that lived in the spaces between words. The courtroom in Harlan Creek was the largest room in the county building, which was not saying much, but Judge Aldrich had arranged it with a quiet authority that communicated immediately that he was not a man who tolerated theater. He was perhaps 60, with a compact, precise manner, and eyes that moved around the room, taking inventory of everything in it, including Eleanor noticed the expressions on the faces of the people present. There were more people than she'd expected. Ben Reardon was there, leg extended, crutch against the wall with Tommy beside him. Mrs. Pruitt had come, which surprised Eleanor. Several of the older farming families were seated in the back rows. Margaret Hollis was there, which surprised Eleanor more. And Gerard Whitfield sat at the plaintiff's table because he'd filed the counterclaim, which made him the plaintiff in this portion of the proceedings, with 2 men from his legal office and an expression of comfortable authority that Eleanor recognized as the expression of a man who had spent a long time winning. She sat at her table with the Denver lawyer, a composed, spare man named Charles Garrett, who had the courtroom manner of someone who had nothing to prove and kept her hands flat on the table and her breathing deliberate. Caleb sat in the row directly behind her. She could feel him there the way you felt weather. Not intrusively, just present. A solid fact at her back. Judge Aldrich opened the proceedings without preamble. He had reviewed the documentation prior to the hearing, he said. He had questions for both parties. He expected direct answers and had no patience for what he called, with a precision that made Whitfield's lawyer shift in his seat, procedural noise. The hearing ran 3 hours. It was not dramatic in the way of stories. It was methodical, systematic. The way real things were not cinematic confrontation, but the slow, careful dismantling of a false position through the accumulation of fact upon fact upon fact. Garrett presented the deed. He presented the original survey record and the county record side by side, and explained the discrepancy in terms so plain that Judge Aldrich nodded twice, the nod of a man who has understood something, and filed it, not the performative nod of someone performing comprehension. Then Garrett called Ben Reardon. Ben made his way to the witness position with his crutch and his broken leg and his 62 years, and he sat down and looked at Judge Aldrich directly and said without being asked to begin, "I was there when Samuel Hayes set those survey stakes, Your Honor. October of 1869. I can describe exactly where each one went and why. You want me to start with the northwest corner, since that seems to be what we're here about." Judge Aldrich looked at Ben for a moment with something that was not quite amusement, but was in the same county. "Please," he said. Ben talked for 20 minutes. He was clear and specific and unimpressed by the setting, and when Whitfield's lawyer tried to cross-examine him on the question of the fallen Ponderosa, Ben said, "Son, I've been looking at that stump from my upper window for 11 years. I know which tree it was. I know where it stood. And I know exactly how far it is from where Mr. Whitfield's men put their flag because I measured it myself 6 weeks ago. 30 feet north. You want to call Tommy Birch up here, he can confirm the measurement." Tommy confirmed the measurement. Whitfield's lawyer made 3 separate attempts to introduce the character question, phrased each time as a concern about property management, about the stability of the homestead, about recent changes in the property's occupancy. Each time Judge Aldrich cut him off with a flat, brief precision that left no room for the next attempt. "Mr. Caldwell," the judge said after the 3rd attempt, "I have reviewed the deed, the survey records, the county documentation, and the witness testimony. I am not interested in the personal arrangements of the property's owner. I am interested in the question of whether the deed is valid and the boundary correctly established. If you have evidence relevant to those questions, present it. If you are attempting to introduce irrelevant material, I will note it in the record." Whitfield at his table did not change expression, but his lawyer sat down, and Eleanor at her table let out a breath so carefully controlled that no one in the room could have seen it. Judge Aldrich ruled from the bench. He did not take the case under advisement. He did not schedule a subsequent date for his decision. He looked at the documentation in front of him, and he looked at the room, and he said in a voice that had the same quality as the final stroke of a hammer on a properly set nail, "The deed presented by Mrs. Eleanor Hayes is valid. The boundary as established in the original survey of October 1869 is confirmed as described with the northwest corner stake located at the site of the Ponderosa, now represented by its stump 30 feet south of the marker placed by the Whitfield survey team. The counterclaim filed by Mr. Gerard Whitfield is dismissed. The property line dispute is resolved in favor of Mrs. Hayes. This matter is closed." He closed the folder. The room was quiet for 1 beat. 2. Then Ben Reardon said clearly and without embarrassment, "Good." Several people in the back rows laughed, a surprised, relieved sound, the kind that came out of people who'd been holding something and suddenly had permission to let it go. Eleanor didn't move. She sat at the table with her hands flat and her spine straight, and felt the ruling land in her chest, like water into dry ground, not dramatic, not explosive, just soaking in, being absorbed, becoming real. Garrett put his hand briefly on her arm. "Congratulations, Mrs. Hayes." "Thank you," she said, "for everything." Whitfield stood. He and his lawyers gathered their materials without speaking, and as he passed Eleanor's table, he stopped just for a moment. He looked at her. Something moved through his face that she couldn't quite read. Not quite concession, not quite respect. Something in between the expression of a man who had met an edge he didn't expect. He nodded once, moved on. Eleanor watched him go. Caleb was at her shoulder before she'd turned around. She turned to look at him. He was watching Whitfield leave, and there was something in his face, a controlled, contained stillness, the expression of a man who has been ready for something and is now standing down from that readiness, careful about doing it gradually. "It's over," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "You can stop watching the door," she said. Something relaxed in his shoulders, not much, but enough to see. "Old habit," he said. "I know," she said. Ben reached them, crutch working steadily, Tommy at his elbow. Ben put both hands on Eleanor's shoulders, the gesture of a man who'd known her long enough to have earned it, and looked at her with the direct warmth of someone who was not going to pretend he wasn't moved. "Samuel would be proud of you," he said. Eleanor met his eyes. "He'd be proud of the fight," Ben said. "But more than that, he'd be glad you're all right. That's what he'd care about most." She put her hand over Ben's, squeezed once, let go. "Thank you, Ben," she said, "for coming, for testifying, for all of it." "Pfft," Ben said. I've been waiting 11 years for an excuse to tell that story about setting the stakes. Don't thank me. It was a pleasure. They rode home in the early afternoon, and the creek road felt different under the horses' feet, or not different, but the same in a way Eleanor noticed for the first time. The same road she'd ridden 12 miles into town on for 2 years of managing alone. The same ponderosas at the ridge. The same creek sound from below the bank. Same mountains, same sky, same Colorado summer. But she was not the same woman on it that she'd been. She was not sure exactly when that had changed. It had not happened at any single moment she could point to. It had happened the way the fence got repaired, and the barn roof got fixed, and the cattle learned which way the new hand moved gradually through repetition, through the accumulation of ordinary mornings. Caleb rode beside her and didn't push her to talk. She was grateful for that. When the Hayes property gate came into view, Eleanor felt something move through her that she could only describe as landing. The specific sensation of arriving back in a place that was entirely undeniably hers, not contested, not threatened, not provisional. Hers. Settled and confirmed and closed. She rode through the gate. Caleb dismounted and opened it, and she rode through, and he came after and closed it behind them, the familiar creak of the gate latch dropping into place. They put the horses up, unsaddled them, brushed them down. They moved through the routine the same way they always did, without assignment, without announcement, each doing the part that was in front of them. When they were done, they stood in the barn doorway for a moment. "I want to tell you something," Eleanor said. He looked at her. "When you came here," she said, "when you showed up in my barn half dead and trying to apologize for it, I made a calculation. I told myself you were a practical resource, a useful problem to solve." She paused. "I want you to know that's not what you are. That's not what you've been. For a long time." Caleb was still. "I don't say things like that easily," she said. "You know that." "I know," he said. "I'm saying it now because the hearing is over and the land is mine, and I don't have an excuse anymore to not say things I should say." She met his eyes directly. "You stayed. Through all of it. The fence and the roof and the outlaws at 2 a.m, and Whitfield's men and the hearing, and you stayed. And it mattered. It matters." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Can I tell you something?" "Yes. When I came up that road," he said, "I wasn't looking for anything. I was done looking. I had been moving for so long away from what happened on that mountain pass that I'd stopped being able to imagine stopping anywhere. Stopping meant staying. Staying meant—" He stopped. Staying meant being someone, in a place. And I didn't know if I was that anymore. Eleanor held his gaze. "You gave me something to be," he said. "Not by asking me to. Just by having work that needed doing and letting me do it. And then by—" He stopped again, chose words. "By letting me be here. Actually here. Not just working. Being here." She understood. Because she had felt the same thing from the other side, the way his presence had shifted the property from a thing she was managing into a place she was living. The difference between surviving something and belonging to it. "You're here," she said, "as long as you want to be." He looked at her, and then slowly, carefully, in the manner of a man who was not certain his gesture was welcome, but had decided the risk was worth the asking, he reached out and took her hand. Not dramatically, not with announcement, just took her hand. His palm against hers, warm and calloused and entirely real. Eleanor looked down at their hands. Then she looked up at him. She had been alone for 2 years and 4 months. She had managed and survived and fought and won, and she had done most of it with her jaw set, and her hands steady, and her feelings locked in a box in the back of her chest. She had told herself it was enough. She had almost believed it. She tightened her fingers around his. "Come inside," she said. "I'll make supper." He didn't let go of her hand. "I'll set the table," he said. They walked across the yard together through the gate between barn and house. and the Colorado afternoon lay across the property in long, warm bands of late summer light across the repaired fence, and the sealed roof, and the clear creek, and the 40 acres of uncontested land that bore Eleanor Hayes's name in a document now confirmed by a federal judge. They went inside. She started supper. He set the table. And in the easy, ordinary quiet of the kitchen, the sound of the fire and the clatter of plates and two people moving around each other with the practiced comfort of people who had been sharing space long enough to know where the other one would be. Something that had been broken for a long time was not broken anymore. Not fixed in the way of repaired things where you could still see the seam, fixed in the way of healed things where the new growth was stronger than what had been there before. Later after supper, they sat on the porch in the last of the light. Ben had said Samuel would be proud. Eleanor sat with that thought the way she sat with all real things, straight-backed, clear-eyed, without flinching from what it meant. She thought about Samuel, who had been solid and steady, and had done what he said he'd do, and who had loved this land, and built it with his hands, and died in February, and left her with 40 acres, and a locked box of documents, and 32 head of cattle, and a grief she'd managed the only way she knew how. She thought he would have liked Caleb Walker, not because Caleb was like him. He wasn't. Samuel was warm and open and spoke his feelings easily and thought the world was fundamentally a decent place. Caleb was made of harder material shaped by harder experience, and he spoke his feelings rarely and precisely and knew exactly what the world cost. But Samuel had always been drawn to useful people. People who showed up and did the work without theater. People who meant what they said. Caleb was that. Above everything else, he was exactly that. "What are you thinking about?" Caleb said. "Samuel," she said. Without hesitation, because she had stopped managing her thoughts quite so tightly, and it turned out the world did not end when she let something true show. Caleb nodded. "Good thoughts. Honest ones," she said. "He was a good man. He'd have liked you, I think." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "I'd have liked to know him." "You'd have argued," she said. "He was an optimist." "And I'm not." "No," she said. "But he had a way with stubborn people." She paused. "He married me after all." Caleb turned to look at her, and something in his face shifted. Not the almost smile she'd been collecting for weeks, but a real one unguarded, the smile of a man who has stopped being careful for a moment. And it changed his face entirely. Made him look younger and less worn. Made him look like someone who had once been easy in the world and might find his way back to it. She let herself look at it directly. She did not look away. "Tomorrow," she said. "I want to start on the east section. The pasture grass is thin, and I want to rotate the cattle before the end of the month." "Early start," he said. "When is it not?" she said. He looked at the sky. 3:30, she said. "Before the heat." He nodded. Settled. Easy. They sat on the porch until the light was gone, and the stars came out hard and clear, the way they did in the mountains in August, and the creek ran over its stones in the dark, and the horses settled in the barn, and the Colorado night came down over 40 acres of land that belonged to Eleanor Hayes, without question, without contest, without condition. She stood up. "Good night, Caleb," she said. "Good night," he said. She went inside. She left the door open behind her. After a moment, she heard his boots on the porch. The door closing. The quiet sound of a man who knew where he was going in a dark house, because he lived there. Eleanor Hayes had ridden out to this country at 23 years old with nothing but a trunk and a new husband, and a stubbornness her mother had called a character flaw. She had built something here. She had buried a man she loved, and held what they'd built, and fought for it, and won. And she had done something harder, still harder than the fence and the hearing, and the sleepless nights, and Whitfield and all of it combined. She had let someone in. Not all the way. Not yet. Real things took time, and she was a woman who understood that time was how you tested whether things were real. But the door was open. She had left it open, and he had come through it not because she was weak and needed saving, but because she was strong and had decided deliberately that strength did not require solitude. That was the hardest lesson of 2 years on 40 acres in the Colorado mountains. That you could be enough on your own and still choose more. She lay down in her bed and listened to the house settle around her, the familiar sounds of her property, her land, her life. And for the first time in 2 years and 4 months, the silence in the house was not absence. It was simply quiet.